Do kind of a little review of what was going on in the background in which he was living. And it's a very, very difficult time. We're talking about the 14th, 15th centuries, all right, which is really 1300s, 1400s, the way that works. And this is just a very chaotic time in Western Europe. And so I have listed out for you some of the problems they have. They are having severe economic difficulties during this time period. And of course you got endemic warfare. In fact, the longest war on record. Who knows what that is? 100 Years' War is raging. And on top of that, you're going to have peasant rebellions. In France, they call them the Jacqueries, and of course, England just call them peasants' rebellions. And then on top of this, you got the disaster, the catastrophe of the bubonic plague, the Black Death, sweeping across Europe, which wipes out just huge, some cases, you know, there are some cities hit by the plague, and we're talking over 50% of the population is wiped out within a matter of days. And of course, on top of this, at the very time when you would think that, you know, the church could really stand in there and really help in this dire time, the church is having huge problems, and you could say is a failure. Now, I didn't add to this list, but I might also add that at this date, you have Muslims in Western Europe, still in Spain, battling. Now you got basically at this point in time, the Reconquista is taking place, where these tiny little northern kingdoms are battling with the Muslims who control the majority of Spain. And of course, the Muslims also, they're knocking on the gates of Eastern Europe trying to take Constantinople. And of course, Constantinople will fall 1415. And so, I mean, you know, it's just Europe is getting hit every which way you can imagine. And yet, in spite of this, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, right? And talk about an incredible turnaround. I mean, I jokingly talk with my students about this time period, say, you know, let's imagine there were aliens and they're hovering over Earth during this time period. Which civilization would you assume is going to become the dominant civilization? You probably wouldn't choose Europe. You know, you probably choose something like, say, China, all right? But you would be wrong, because after 1492, what we call Western civilization, which I would say is a global civilization today, is going to explode upon the globe and will become the world dominant civilization, which is really, really remarkable when you think of that. And of course, going on, well, this thing's been giving me trouble. Yeah.
Just in general, was the terrible...
Jonathan, could you come grab this, put a new battery in? I think it's dead. Oh, good. Yes, sir.
Was the terrible situation in Europe behind Columbus sailing the ocean blue, or was that just coincidental?
Oh, well, I'm a Christian. Nothing's coincidental. Okay. All right. There's all sorts of factors at work here, which would take a long time to get into. But for one thing, we're about to become dominant in technology and in science. And ironically, despite what those who are, you know, it's astonishing when you look at some of the scientific profession today, you know, they would say that Christianity's held back science. Any philosopher of science will tell you that it is because of Christianity, science is, I mean, just off the top of my head, you know, all the major world civilizations had astrology. Only in Christian Europe does it become astronomy, you know, and on we could go. And there's all sorts of things. You have, and really in polytheism or all the other religions of the day, only Christianity and Judaism Even within Islam, even though it's a theistic religion, it had some very anti-science elements within it. And I know a lot of people say, well, the Muslims did this, the Muslims did that. You'll see YouTube articles all, about that. But what you'll find out is most of the accomplishments in these Islamic countries were the Nestorian Christians or the Jews. And even though they may have Arabic names, with cursory investigation, you'll find out that these were occurring within Islamic lands, but it was a time period where they weren't being virulently, Islamic, and therefore these people were allowed briefly to flourish. But in Christian Europe, there's all sorts of. You need to go back to previous lectures on YouTube. Rise of Christianity, and particularly the section on medieval Christianity, and I talk about this. But we're going to try to launch ahead because I'm trying to get further this year. Okay, so in fact, I think even this lecture may be up there, but I figured this would be a good place to launch off again. So you got all these problems, yet remember we got the Renaissance is about to hit, and all this science and technology. I would just re-emphasize though on science. It is no accident that the scientific so-called revolution, and that's controversial in itself, it happened when it happened and where it happened. Because since, in polytheism, you can't really have science because, you can't examine the forces of nature because that would be blasphemous, right? Thunder, lightning, there's Jupiter, this other god, Zeus, that's the reason for that, and you question that, then you're committing blasphemy. What you need is a system in which you have a God who is outside and greater than the creation. And that's what you have with Judaism and Christianity. The problem is the Jews, were interested in theology. They weren't too interested in science. The Greeks were very interested in science, but they really couldn't do true science because of their polytheism. So what you need was Greek ideas fusing with Judaic ideas, and that happens when and where? Well, it begins with the Roman Empire, because Rome conquers Judah. And then, even then you have problems with Judaism mixing with, the pagans, obviously, that's oil and water. But what happens? The pagans are converted by Christianity. And so you have this voila, this incredible synthesis take place. And of course, this shake, medieval period, you already have the beginnings of science, foundations being laid during this time period, And so all of that is percolating in the background. Now, but we need to focus on what's going on with the church. And so let's get into that. This is just depicts for you, it's a rough time to live in Europe. And this, some talk about the terrors of the church previously is involved in shall we say, punishing heretics. This is just to show you that secular punishments were every bit as bad, in fact, worse. These are some of the capital punishments. They got a guy that they began drawing and quartering. They got, of course, different various hangings, putting you on the rack, just all kinds of terrible things. It was not a good time to face justice back then, needless to say. Now, so we got the problems with the church. And I want you to understand, though, do not think that means that people were irreligious during the medieval period. They were very religious. I would say almost bordering on superstition. You have just thousands of people going on pilgrimage still. You have, of course, along with this, though, every little community would try to gather collections of their holy relics, and you have, one of the wags of the day made the comment that if all the splinters of the true cross were really, splinters of the true cross, the entire forest would be denuded. Because people would chop down a tree, make splinters, dip it in a little blood, and then they say, this is, and people would buy this stuff. There's all kinds of fakery and quackery going on at this time. But this is nothing really new, is it? I can remember A number of years back, we had this Reverend Tilton. You show your age, you remember him. You know, he's up there in Dallas, and you know, he, I remember one of the news programs finally went after him and got him, so to speak, exposing all his quackery. And I was sitting there. At that time, we would have not only ladies in the lighthouse, but we also took in some men. And a gentleman was seated there while we're watching this program. And the Reverend, they were saying how Tilton would have these prayer cloths, you know, and you write these prayer requests to him, and he had in shape of a handprint, and he promised he'd put his hand on your prayer request and pray for you directly. Just all kinds of, you know, little gadgets to try to get people sending money. And then they showed where all these requests actually wound up. Anybody know? You saw the program? Yeah, a dumpster behind the bank where all these things, he didn't go to the church, went straight to the bank, and they just opened the envelopes, get the money out and throw the request, and pictures of people who are ill and sick. You know, it's terrible. Well, he went to prison, by the way. But anyway, you know, you had a lot of this going on in the medieval period too. But you also have some very sincere Christians, which we're about to run into here. And so, with this, let's talk a little about the big scandal in the church during this very difficult time period in European history, and how the church, you know, failed the people. At least the organized church did. The Catholic Church is what we're talking about. And here we got, of course, we're talking about the Great Schism, or Schism, and that word is just a fancy word for division, dividing. And this is a dispute that has its roots going back to something that is going on before the schism itself happens, which is what we're about to talk about, and that's the so-called Babylonian captivity of the church, right? Now, what was the original Babylonian captivity? Students of the Old Testament. Somebody, anybody? Well, it's the taking of the Jews. Yeah, by Nebuchadnezzar, right? And of course, that's what they're referring back to. Now, this is not the true Babylonian captivity. This is when the popes. Now, by the way, the popes are also the bishops of what? Rome, bishops of Rome. Okay. Well, if you're a bishop of Rome, where should you reside? Rome. You would think, right? Well, the Babylonian captivity of the papacy is a time period in which the popes abandon Rome and they go up to a beautiful little valley that's today in southern France. At the time, is technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it's very, very close to the border of France, and it's called Avignon. Just beautiful, beautiful location. And one of the popes traveling through there decided, I'll build myself sort of like a vacation, you know, place here. And then what we're about to launch into, you're going to have a whole group of popes decide, we're not going to just visit, we're going to stay. And this is where we're going to build our papal palace in Avignon. And these popes up there at Avignon would be referred to as the Babylonian captivity popes. All right, although it is voluntary captivity, they go up there and they abandon Rome. All right, so the origins of this goes back to Pope Boniface VIII. And he doesn't leave, he's in Rome. Let's keep that straight. He gets into a dispute with Philip the Fair. That's his nickname. He had fair complexion. He's not fair, though. He's one of the most corrupt kings of the medieval period. And of course, Philip the Fair, as is typical of this time period, is having problems with England, right? And so he wants money to fight his war with England, and he decides the church has a lot of money, which it definitely does, right? So he wants to tax the church. That's always been controversial. Here in this country, we've solved that how? You're tax exempt. You know, there's forces right now that want to do away with that, and they need to go stay their medieval history. All right, that's going to cause trouble if you do that. So anyway, he gets into this big tussle with Pope Boniface over taxation of the church. I'm just greatly summarizing here. And Pope Boniface responds, and not too good of a picture of him there, with unum sanctum. Unum sanctum. This is a papal bull which he issues, and he basically tells King Philip the Fair that the Pope is the supremest most being on the planet. I am more powerful than you. In fact, I'm more powerful than any other king on the planet, and whatever I say goes, and if you refuse to go along with me, basically you're going to go to hell, literally, all right? Okay, unum sanctum. This was, a big power grab by the Pope. Well, Philip the Fair responds to that by having some of his henchmen kidnap the Pope. This is almost unprecedented in history. We already have had some wild situations with popes prior to this, but to kidnap the Pope. And they take him up into northern Italy, and they're holding him at a castle, and they're still trying to get him to agree to this taxation, and he's not agreeable, and so they start beating the daylights out of him, literally. And some of the servants at the castle are shocked, and so they run out into the streets of the village below, say they're beating the Pope, and the people get all upset, and they rush the castle, and they free Boniface. He flees back to southern Italy, and subsequently, shortly thereafter, though, dies. All right, he's a very old man when all this happened to him. This must have been pretty traumatic for him. And of course, Clement, his successor is Benedict the 11th, but he only rules for 1 year as Pope. And he dies under mysterious circumstances. At the time, many people believe he was poisoned, and they think he's poisoned by henchmen of Philip the Fair, who's not fair, right? Got that down now. And then he's replaced by Clement V. And Clement V was basically an outright puppet of Philip the Fair. And in fact, they apparently had a prior agreement for him becoming Pope. And so he becomes Pope, and he pretty much cooperates with Philip the Fair. And one of the most, and so let me try to get this in a little bit more order for you. Here you got Boniface the 8th, then Benedict the 11th, and now we're to Clement the 5th. And one of the really notorious, just sickening things that he is involved with Philip the Fair with is the destruction of the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Templar got their start over in the Crusades, but they had basically become bankers, which is a topic that can get real confusing in a hurry, because technically, see, at this time in Europe, Christians not supposed to be charging other Christians interest, right? And especially a monastic order, which is what Knights Templar are. But they had ways to get around it where basically they're not calling interest. And so they had become incredibly wealthy. And there's all kinds of wild stories about the Knights Templars, that they had discovered and were holding in secret the Holy Grail. Just all kinds of wild stories about them. All sorts of things. You go on YouTube, you can just have incredible fun listening to stuff about the Knights Templars. About 95% of it's not true, okay? Just know that. They actually did a lot of good works. If you need to build an orphanage, go to the Knights Templar. They would give you a very low-cost loan, basically. Or if you want to build a church, and that's why you got Knights Templars stuff all over a lot of churches. It's not because it's secret signs. It's mainly advertisement. This is how you go to if you want to get cheap loans, stuff like that. But what he did to get rid of the Knights, and the reason Philip the Fair goes after the Knights Templars is because they had large reserves of cash, and he wanted it. And so what does he do? He comes out with this blanket accusation that they're all homosexuals, which is, capital offense back then. And he has them arrested, has them tortured until many of them confess to this, even though it wasn't really true. And then he executes them. A Christian monastic order, which had done just incredible good works, he just wipes it out, and with the connivance and support of the then Pope. All right, Clement V. Now, and it is also Clement who goes to Avignon and decides to stay there. It is Clement V that starts the Babylonian captivity, the papacy. All right, so he's the Pope of the notorious, suppression of the Knights Templars. He's the Pope that basically sells out to this corrupt king, and he's the Pope that begins the Babylonian captivity. And so just a couple other examples of the Babylonian captivity popes. You got John the 22nd. He is notorious because this is the high point or low point, whichever you want to call it, of the over-the-top materialism. One thing I can say about the Babylonian captivity of the papacy there at Avignon, in terms of bureaucracy, it was a well-oiled cash machine. You got to remember, this is a time period in which everyone pays a tithe, 10th of your income. It's not voluntary, okay? It is required. And that makes the church the richest, you could say like this, bureaucracy or corporation in the world, And all this is coming into Avignon, and they are just lavishly spending this on parties and all kinds of lavish entertainments, sumptuous furnishings, and just beautiful palaces that they're building for the Pope and the bishops and all of this. So it is a time period of incredible worldliness within the church. So that's John the 22nd. And by the way, he had such a lavish personal lifestyle. He is the Pope who at one time came very close to the cusp of totally suppressing. In fact, he almost abolished the Franciscan order. Now, if you know anything about medieval Christianity, the Franciscans were some of the true believers who, they would give up everything and go 2 by 2, with their staff, following the directions of Jesus himself, and they would witness. In fact, many say the Franciscans are one of the reasons that Christianity survived in the newly growing urban cities. They went not only to the countryside, but to the urban areas, what we would say the low-income areas of town, and they would witness, and they would, in a very personal way, share, and they would refuse to take an income. They would beg for their food for the day. And they're just very humble. And this made them embarrassing to Pope John the 22nd because his lifestyle was so in opposition to their lifestyle. And so he doesn't totally shut them down, but he's moving that direction. But fortunately, he dies. He's replaced by Benedict the 11th. And of course, on our Benedict the 11th, you have the 100 Years' War beginning. Now, he didn't start it, English and the French do that by themselves, but he doesn't do much to help. In fact, I shouldn't say that. He does do quite a bit. He basically comes out and says, the French are the good guys and the English are the bad guys. And by the way, you Englishmen give your tithe so I can then take it and loan it to the King of France, who will then use it to hire soldiers to kill your sons on the battlefield. Now, what are the tithes supposed to be used for? Yeah, to do good works, to take care of the widow, the poor, dispossess, all this sort of stuff. Was it intended to be loaned to a king of another country at war? No. All right. And by the way, this should help you understand when we get to Wycliffe, probably one of the reasons Wycliffe is going to get away with so much is because the English were so angry at the Catholic Church, the papacy siding with the French and even giving assistance to the French, to make war on England. And so this also really convinces everyone, at least in England, that the Avignon popes are just basically French puppets. Now, the truth is not all of them were, but several were, and it just, they have this sort of bubbling anger. I think this is also a reason when Henry VIII finally breaks with the Catholic Church, there's really amazingly very little opposition. Most countries of Europe, when you have a split from the Catholic Church during this time period, you got we call it the Wars of Reformation. You don't have a war of Reformation in England. Henry, we'll get to that later. He says, today you're Catholic, tomorrow you're going to be Protestant, you're going to love it, and it's not nearly that simple, but it's amazing how easily the English got through that. So you get Benedict. Then, sorry to say, it keeps on going. You got Clement VI, and he's Pope at the height of the Black Death. Now, we don't have time to get into details of Black Death, but it's pretty bad, and the Pope, of course, is looking very helpless. And by the way, who had the highest incidence of death during the Black Death? What group of people? Well, they're all Christians technically, right? You're in Europe this time, you're born and you're immediately baptized, and so they would say, their view. But, stop and think of it. People living in close proximity with one another, sometimes drinking from the same cup. Who would that describe? Large numbers of people in an enclosed community, the monasteries and the convents. They were in some cases just, I used to have students read a letter from a monk writing at the height of the Black Death, and he's diary entries, and he says, buried brother so-and-so today, buried so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, buried so-and-so, and finally gets down and says, buried brother so-and-so, now only I remain, and I have it. Who will bury me? That's how bad it was, okay? And so what Clement does is he comes out and he just makes this declaration that everybody dies of the Black Death. I'm going to give you preliminary grace. In other words, by power of the Pope, I'm going to open the gates of heaven and you'll all be saved. All right. Now, what do you think in the backs of a lot of people's mind? Do you really have the power and the authority to do that? Right? And so even though, I'm sure it gave comfort to some folks, but it may have been false comfort, right? In fact, I'm pretty sure it was. Okay, and he didn't have that power. And so this also, I think, these sort of drip things that the popes are doing is what really causing people to begin to question the authority of the papacy. So, and now let's skip forward. We've had enough Babylonian popes. We're going to skip down to the last one, which is Gregory the 11th, and see 1378. He is going to finally end the Babylonian captivity because he leaves Avignon and he goes back to Rome to retake up his residence there. All right. And you see, this has been a big complaint, all kinds of controversies this whole time they're up there at Avignon. And so he decides, well, I'll go back to Rome. All right. Now, he's also the Pope that we're going to see is going to confront Wycliffe, at least the first time. And he's not going to be successful, but he will be the first one to condemn Wycliffe. But when he dies at Rome, he goes back to Rome, but then shortly thereafter dies. The College of Cardinals, which now is the group that elects the popes, right? They were all in Rome, so they decided to convene their meeting to elect a new pope. Okay. Now you got to remember, all this time, the kings of France, starting with Philip the Fair, they have been stacking the deck in favor of French, cardinals. In other words, so they could elect popes that would be favorable towards France. Well, usually popes are what? Nationality. They're usually Italian. But, some of them, since the Babylonian captivity, have not been. And now imagine what life has been like in Rome all these years of the Babylonian captivity. What's the problem for Rome not having a pope there? What's the number one industry of Rome? Tourism. And what's the number one thing you want to see? Yeah, go to St. Peter's and be standing in that vast crowd of people, and the Pope comes out on that balcony and does this, and people go crazy. All right, well, And then all around the city of Rome, you got all kinds of religious trinkets for sale, and no pope, no sale. All right? No pope, no crowds. And so the Italians had been in economic depression all these years because the pope hadn't been residing. And they got a legitimate gripe here. The pope is also the bishop of Rome. He should be in Rome. So what happens during this conclave of the Cardinals about to elect a new pope? The people of Rome rise up in a riot, and they besiege the palace where the bishops are meeting, and they're screaming, "You better elect an Italian pope, or we're going to tear you to shreds." Now, of course, popes are supposed to be elected by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and that's what the Cardinals will say. And so they, guess what? They have an Italian pope. And this is going to be Urban, okay? Urban VI. Now, the choice of Urban was very curious at the time because most popes are almost always very upper class nobility, all right? Usually it's the second, third, fourth sons of nobility. And why is that?
Because they don't inherit.
That's right. Yeah, you see, many of the nobility treated the church as sort of the, you could almost say the retirement home or what would take care of my younger sons, because, only the eldest, would inherit. And, but usually, so bishops were often the third, fourth, sons of nobility. The upper level of the medieval church, remember the church is reflecting the governmental structure of the day, where you have, kings or emperors, and then you have dukes or nobles, lords, and then you have, the knights, and then, of course, 95% of people are peasants, right? And early medieval period, they wouldn't be that, they'd be serfs. So in the church, you got the Pope, and then you have cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and down to the priest would be the equivalent of the knights, right? Okay, and remember, this totally flies against, there is neither what? Male nor female, Jew nor Greek, for we're all one in Christ Jesus, you see. But remember, this is why Wycliffe is so important. How many medieval people have ever read that passage? Yeah, they don't want you to read that, right? Okay, and that's why Wycliffe is going to be so very, very important. He's going to blow the lid off this. All right, so anyway, you got Urban. He is selected, and he is a peasant background. Why do you think these cardinals would nominate a person of such low background? Yeah, they think, okay, well, we can't have a French pope or someone favorable to France. The Italians demand an Italian pope. I think we better give them one or they're going to tear us to shreds. So let's pick one that we can easily manipulate. And so they pick Urban VI. Trouble, they don't know this. Urban is apparently, we're not sure what. My guess would be he's beginning to show signs of entering into schizophrenia. In other words, they nominate a mad pope. Okay, yeah. And Urban, after being elected, turns around and arrests some of these very, guys who elected him into prison and then ordered them to be tortured. Now, this is very unusual for high-class nobility, who's also clergy, to be put to torture, And so the rest of the conclave flee back up to Avignon. All right, these are most of the French ones. And they have another conclave, and they elect a second pope, right? And so, therefore, they selected a new pope, and I think I got the number wrong there. And So what you now have is the Great Schism. All right, Great Schism has now emerged. You got two popes, Urban and then Clement, and they're reigning at two different courts. One's down in Rome, one's up in Avignon, and they both are claiming to be the one and only legitimate pope. And just to make clear everyone understands this, they excommunicate each other. Okay? Now, can you imagine the split this causes and the scandal? There have been so-called anti-popes in the past, but never before had you had one that was duly elected by a conclave of cardinals, all right? And of course, Urban has the advantage of being the first one elected, but he has the disadvantage of the very people who elected him turn around and say, no, you were elected under duress, which is partly true. And so now the thing is, this is going to self-perpetuate itself because which pope do you think those who are enemies of France are going to follow? The one in Avignon or the one in Rome? Yeah. Guess which one England's for then? I've already told you. Yeah, they're following Urban. And they pretend when it becomes very obvious that he really is loony, okay, they still know he's the right pope, okay, because he's not the French pope, okay. So now, now this is very, it sounds kind of humorous. I guess as Protestants we can kind of chuckle at this. It was devastating because remember, for the sincere believers, they take popes very seriously. And if you follow the wrong pope, this might mean what? You're going to hell, right? And you actually had some situations where you got two different priests showing up to take over the local church. One follows Clement, one follows Urban. And the people are there. Remember, they have no idea, Baptists, we'd have a nice, Baptist fight, right? Okay, and, we're going to argue this one out. They had no experience. They have no self-rule. They have no self-government. And they're just, which one's right? We have no idea, And it was a crazy, crazy situation. And the politicians actually love this. Why do you think they love it? Well, think of yourself as local prince, and it's governmental responsibility to collect the tithe to ship it over to the church. And how about this little game you might play as a politician? I am distraught over this situation, and all this money I've collected, big pile of money, it would be sinful for me to send it to the wrong pope. So I'm just going to hold it here. Might have to use a little bit of it until the church hashes this out. We're just not going to send a tithe to either one. Now, of course, others would send a tithe to one or the other because, it's politically beneficial for them to do so. So it was a horrible situation, needless to say. And the trouble is, as I also said, both of them excommunicate the other. And the hope was when one dies, there'll only be one pope and they'll end it, right? Well, no, it doesn't. Guess why? Both forms their own separate college of cardinals. And when one dies, then this is perpetuated. You have this period. Now, of course, Wycliffe is going to really benefit in the background because of this. That's probably one of the main reasons he's never burned at the stake like other people with his ideas would be. Okay, so everybody understand this? I just kind of want to jump forward. Just a little cartoon showing the popes fighting here. And with this, we get to John Wycliffe. Now, we really don't know very much about his early life at all. John Wycliffe. And by the way, his name's spelled various different ways. In fact, I think I got two different spellings. There was one slide here. Various spellings. But he was apparently a brilliant young man. And we do know from one of his writings, he was kind of full of himself. Very prideful. He, of course, winds up at Oxford. He's somewhat delayed because of the confusion of the day before he got his doctorate, but he finally gets his doctorate. He is a very popular professor teaching there. And then he actually gets in trouble with the church initially, not so much over doctrine, but over politics. Because Wycliffe, I put it like this. He had some political views that were colored, shall we say, by the day in which he was living. Wycliffe, at some point, apparently had a personal conversion experience. We're not quite sure when it happened, but we know that he came to the belief, that Christians should not be about materialism, that Christians should be sharing Christ. And the church should be the exemplar of this. And what does he see at the church of his day?
The opposite.
Yeah, the opposite. And now you got to remember, this is a time in which there are no Baptists, okay? This idea of separation church and state is not even a glimmer in any person's eye at this point in time. And all he knew was the church had utterly failed at behaving itself, so to speak. So he thought probably the best thing to do is let each ruler of each nation be the one to be in authority over the church. Now, we know that doesn't work either, but at the time period, I think you can understand why he thought this. And he therefore felt he was in favor of the state taking over the wealth of the church, because he didn't think the church, he thought money and wealth was one of the things ruining the church, And so he comes out and he argued that the government should take over these ecclesiastical properties. Now let me remind you that the church is the largest landowner in Europe. How did this happen? Well, during the medieval period, let's say you were a scoundrel, you lied, cheated, stole, took advantage of people, but now you're on your deathbed, and remember, this is a time period, nobody questions heaven, but also nobody questions what else? Hell. And you're there on your bed, and you're thinking, oh, what a scoundrel I've been, I'm probably going where? Hell. And of course, they had the idea that, well, perhaps I can buy myself out of hell. Give my worldly possessions, since I'm dying, it's not going to do me any good now. You finally come to that realization. I'm going to give all my worldly possessions to the church, and they're going to have these monks and nuns pray for me for 30 years out of purgatory, and then I'll be okay. Right? And so guess what happens century after century after century after century of this happening? More and more people gave their possessions to the church, and so the church has these vast landed estates all over the place. And Wycliffe, foxes have holes, birds have nests, said who? Jesus. But the Son of Man has not even a place to lay my head. And now what we have with the institution he founded, pretty much all the places you could lay your head, the church owns now, you see. And so Wycliffe said, this should not be, okay? And so he is going to, and partly what initiates all this, which I don't really have time to get into, you have ruling in England at this time, Edward III. And Edward III, of course, is in the midst of the 100 Years' War. And he has several sons, 5 sons actually, but the 2 we're going to talk about. One is the Black Prince. Black Prince is very famous medieval history, particularly the 100 Years' War. He's called the Black Prince because he had this armor that was painted black. And of course, he was very charismatic, war leader, defeated the French over and over again, very, very famous. And then you have his younger brother, the third brother, which is going to figure very prominently what we're about to talk about, which is John of Gaunt, who's also, by the way, protector of Geoffrey Chaucer. But anyway, you have the church at this time was trying to enact additional revenues on England. This goes back to King John, of Magna Carta fame, although he was opposed to Magna Carta. Long story, but John had made a deal with one of the popes at that time that, the kings of England would give the church a certain payment. And the kings of England had ceased doing that, and now suddenly they come back and say, you need to start making those payments again, all right? And they asked leading churchman in England, a scholar, what do you think about this? Wycliffe. And what's Wycliffe going to say? No, the church has got too much money as it is, And so they're actually going to send him on a sort of like an ambassador to negotiate terms with the church. And in the process, he's going to write this big document in which he goes into excruciating detail of the abuses of the church. He is a churchman himself, and he knows the score. And this is going to be very embarrassing to the church. And by the way, remember Benedict condemning Wycliffe? This was the initial condemnation of his political writings, which of course are heavily involved with religion as well. So you're going to have him arguing the church should divest itself of material wealth. Okay, that was a pretty radical idea. A pope like John the 22nd that we've mentioned, what do you think he'd think about that idea, divesting itself of its wealth? Now, that's not going to go over very well. Then he also comes out with this: the church is made up of predestined believers. Shows a little bit of Augustinian influence here, and you could say early Reformed theology already, but not quite the same. But here he says, the church is the totality of those who are predestined to blessedness. It includes the church triumphant in heaven and the church militant or men on earth. No one who is eternally lost has part in it. There is one universal church, and outside of it there is no salvation. Its head is Christ. No pope may say that he is the head. Remember unum sanctum, right? He's just going directly in the face of the popes that claim that they're the supremest being on earth, And he says, no pope may say he is the head, for he cannot say that he is elect or even a member of the church. In other words, he's saying, ultimately, we don't know who the elect are, and obviously by the behavior of some of the popes, even some of the popes are going to hell. Now, by the way, if you think that is a very radical statement, you go to Dante's Divine Comedy, one of the most classic literary pieces of the day, and guess what Dante does with the popes he didn't like? He puts them in different levels of hell, And by the way, some of those Babylonian captivity popes were very prominently mentioned by Dante and the lower levels of hell that they're in, okay? So it's not just, this is not that radical. Other people have the same attitude. In fact, in some ways, he's almost like a Luther in that he's touching on hot button issues that a whole bunch of people are agreeing with. He's vocalizing what a lot of people are thinking here. Okay, so, and then this is also quite amazing. It sounds very Protestant. In fact, Wycliffe is often referred to, I think it's a beautiful description of him, he's described as the morning star of the Reformation. In other words, he's not really part of the Reformation, but he's a precursor to the Reformation. And I really do believe that he in many ways sets the foundation for the coming of the Reformation with some of his ideas here. They approach Protestantism, but since he is thoroughly within the medieval period and he's totally immersed in this medieval Catholicism, he doesn't quite get there in some areas, but in other areas he gets amazingly close. And here he comes: the Bible alone is the basis for all belief and authority. Now, can anyone tell me why this so goes against Catholic teaching at this time? Well, they say church tradition, but it's even more basic than that. Guess what the Catholic Church position to this day is as far as the Bible? Well, they say that they gave us the Bible. All right. Meaning the Catholic Church. And only they, the Catholic magisterium, only they can interpret the Bible. All right? All right, and that was the view. And he's saying, no, the Bible alone is the basis for all authority. He argued for the unique authority of the Bible as the basis for belief in the life of a Christian. Therefore, he declared that every Christian should know the Bible. And that's radical, because at this point in time, probably 90% of people are illiterate. Now, remember, if you gone back and heard me when I gave the lecture on medieval Christianity, Medieval Christians knew more about Christianity than I would say modern Americans do, despite the fact they were illiterate. Because you want to be real honest, most Americans are illiterate when it comes to the Bible. But at least in the medieval era, they all went to church, and yeah, it's in Latin, they don't know what the heck they're saying, but well, they look all around them.
Stories.
Yeah, on one side you got the stained glass windows, which were the PowerPoints of that day, telling Bible stories. And remember the little kiddies that come in, have their catechism, and the priest will look at this window. You got this guy there, and he's got this boy on this altar, and he's got a dagger up like he's about to strike him. And this is beautiful colored, sparkling glass. The sun's playing through there. I mean, that would be, for a little peasant child seeing that window for the first time, this would just be visual overload, they'd be so bored today. But, but back then it didn't take much, just incredible stimulation. And then they tell them the story of what? Huh? Yeah, Abraham and Isaac, yeah. And so they knew Bible stories. They all sorts of oral tales. They actually were probably much more biblically literate, even though they were illiterate, if you get my point here. All right, and I saw a news program not too long ago, and it's just going down the streets. They're asking people just very basic Bible questions like, who is Abraham? Nobody knew. It's just really astonishing where we're at today. But anyway, he declared that every Christian should know the Bible, and which he believed would result in every Christian realizing that Christ alone is sufficient for salvation. Pilgrimages, which is what so many people were doing at this time, make themselves worthy. Good works, also try to make yourself worthy. Attending the Mass, that would not save you. Christ and Christ alone is the author of salvation. And that was quite impressive. Now, here's the next thing he does. He's not just an idealist, he's a practical person. If people need to read the Bible, they need to read it in their own language. And so he begins this epic translation of the Bible. Now, he has a big problem that Luther doesn't have, though. And I think it's one of the major reasons the Reformation doesn't break out right here and now. And what's the big problem? There's no printing press. Each of these Bibles, first off, they had to translate it. And, it takes a long time. Just reading the Bible takes a little while. You already do this campaign with Jeff right now, okay? Just New Testament. It's going to take a little while. Imagine, translating the entire Bible. And he's going to have his assistants to help him with this. In fact, much of the Wycliffe Bible probably wasn't actually translated by Wycliffe, as others that he oversaw doing the translation. But quite a bit of it he did translate. And it's handwritten. But we all know the Word of God is powerful. And just the few scraps, the few books of New Testament that he does get translated, and they hand copy multiple copies. And he's going to, his followers, a lot of them were college students, he's going to call them and send them out 2 by 2, sort of like St. Francis did. And they're going to go preaching, and it's going to cause a revolution. In fact, it causes what's called the Lollard Movement. The meanings of Lollard is very controversial to this day, but some call them mumblers, but they are going to have a powerful impact upon the church. And this shows him. See over there is a very important person. Anyone want to guess who he is? In the fancy clothes over there, the red tunic. That's John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt, at this time, the richest man in England. He's also regent. You see, the king, Edward III, was ill. He's dying, actually. His heir, which is the Black Prince, is also ill, and he's also dying. And so the Black Prince's son, which is the future Richard, he's just a little kid. And so John of Gaunt is actually the ruler. He could have seized the throne probably pretty easily had he wanted to. He never does. Now later on, his son will become King of England. John of Gaunt's son will be Henry Bolingbroke. But anyway, he is going to be the guy very unlikely person in many ways, that's going to rise up and protect Wycliffe from the Catholic Church when they try to go after him. And I cannot believe it, but we're about out of time. So let's see. Then we get to 4. The English should have the English Bible. Therefore, he does this translation of the Bible. And let's see what y'all think about this. This is one of the hand-copied versions here. That's kind of hard for you to see there, so let's go to this. Matt, why don't you try to read that? I think you can read it because you know what it is.
Okay. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was at God, and God was the Word. This was in the beginning at God. All things were made by him, and without him was made no thing that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and darkness comprehendeth not it.
Where's the accent here on that? Okay. You can see, you can make it out even though it's mid-English, you know. And now you want to really have some fun, do Old English. It looks more German than English. But one of the worst times in my college career was taking a class where I had to learn Old Middle English. And
did he finish the translation?
Yeah, well, not he. His major assistant is going to complete it, and then it's going. But of course, we'll find out next time that the Catholic Church is going to go after this translation big time. They're very upset about it. But it's 10 o'clock, so I'm going to have to end it there.